Welcome to Suncoast In-Depth Podcast. My name is Brett Watson. I'm here with my buddy Troy Doucet. And, well, I got a text last night.
Yeah.
I have to figure out a label for these texts that I get from Troy, various times of the night. So this one, he just there's no precursor to it or anything. It's just, here's what he texts me.
Jump in.
Actions are otherwise meaningless in themselves, i.e. resting, washing someone's feet, etc. Become both significant and sacred because of the mythological situatedness that God once performed these very same things. Thus, the action of loving the otherness of the other, what Levinas, called alterity, I had to look that up, takes preference over self-love because God's love of himself was displaced within something totally other than himself to make it as himself, all of creation. I was like, all right, dude. I sat on the end of my bed and I stared at that and I looked up a couple things. I'm like, okay, let's see. So anyway, I love it.
Yeah.
And after I read that and several others that we texted back and forth, I thought this would be a cool podcast, right? Mm-hmm. It got me thinking about creation, right? And not only that, I mean, this season is unique in that it shows the contrast that's going on inside human minds about the creation, right? Mm-hmm. So this is the darkest time of the year for most of the globe, right?
Right.
And we have this holiday situated, even pagans, Christians, whatever.
Yep.
And it's all about bringing light to that darkest time of the year. So, but we were talking about the creation, right? Mm. And I thought, what would be a good conversation to have about that? And I thought, what was the motivation? What was the motivation for God? I mean, spoiler alert, we both believe that there's a God, a creator, right? I'm sorry to my atheist friends. We'll have Kevin O'Hara in here soon. Anyway, so the idea that God created is that's just something that's kind of a given for us, right? But the motivation for that creation, like why create? We don't think that God was not self-sufficient enough, that he was lonely or something like that, right? What do you think?
Well, it's a hard question. You're asking to delve into like the mind of God itself, himself, herself. Mm-hmm. But I think what we can do is take a look at creation itself for the hints, right? And how creation itself acts within itself.
That's really all we got, right?
That's all we can do, and that's the observational power of science, right? Yeah. But what we have to be, what Heidegger, one of my heroes, in terms of his understanding of being, what we have to be sort of cautious of is to not place that understanding, what we're looking for, in this sort of propositional state of truth. So like I look at creation as a type of art, right? And what the human mind does is we try to sort of constitute things logically, which I understand. So we would say something like a painting is a work of art. Brett is an artist. Therefore, Brett's paintings constitute art. So those propositional statements about creation, I think, betray us if we try to look for motivations within the human construction of cognition, right? So what we have to do is say there must be something about God that prompts creativity, right? Creation has too much baggage, man, when we talk about that word creation. Just being itself is kind of what, the language I kind of use. And so what motivates us to create? And I think I sent you a text. Sometimes we create to uncreate. Most of our creations are to control, coerce, or what's another C word I'm trying to be like? We to control, to coerce.
You're trying to be rhetorically
Yeah, I'm trying to be
creative.
rhetorically clever here, but most of our creations are to control nature in a particular kind of way.
Yeah.
Like nature, the nature of the liquid in this cup will run all over the place. So what do? We create a container that holds in the natural state of the liquid, right?
Yeah.
We create shelters to sort of control nature from us being stormed upon. And that's been the sort of historical dilemma of all things when we talk about creation. You look at the Old Testament, Genesis, right, which stems from a lot of Sumerian and Assyrian creation stories. Whatever is created is always created within this element of struggle over and against overwhelming odds. Karen Armstrong lays this out very well in her book, A History of God. And when you look at the Old Testament in Genesis, it says that God's Spirit was hovering over these waters of tohu vavohu, which is void and emptiness, the chaotic,
Right.
to bring into creation, but order, right? And most things are created to uncreate the chaotic. I don't know if that makes sense or not, man. But
No, yeah, I think it does. But so you kind of laid out some motivations that people have, right? And like you said, we don't want to. How did Heidegger put it? Propositional.
yeah, to base it in a propositional
Yeah,
form of
yeah.
logic. Yeah.
But all we have to work with is the creation. But what's interesting to me is that as far as a frame of reference goes, right?
Yeah.
And so that includes ourselves. But what's interesting to me is that we not only create these propositions, right? But we also have this notion that there's something beyond those propositions. And that's kind of weird, isn't it? Like, you follow me? Like,
Yeah.
So then, thinking about, at least for me, when I think about, well, what was God's motivation to create? And I realize a lot of people, they're like, why do you even bother thinking about that? I don't know, but I do. I like thinking about these things.
Yeah.
It's not that it's super productive for humanity or anything like
Yeah.
that, but it's interesting. And so when I think about that, I'm like, one of the weird things about that thought process is I feel like there is a motivation that is not about controlling, but ultimately about freedom, where we are typically creating in order to bring order, in order to control.
Right.
But it seems, in my mind, there's this idea that God doesn't do that. He didn't create in order to control, at least not ultimately.
Right.
But that eventually it's about freedom. And I think even beyond that, love. This is where O'Hara would roll his eyes. He's like, what the hell is love,
Yeah.
But that's a hard thing to answer, right?
Right.
But I think that ultimately it is about love. So let's try to unpack that a little bit for people.
Yeah, that's tough because I agree with you. The human propensity is to create in order to control, to overcome physis or nature, right? The destructive chaos of nature, right? Because we think we live in an orderly universe. No, bro, it's freaking chaotic out there. You get out into space, you have things that are just flying, just amok. And we're just lucky, like we just haven't had a cataclysm hit us in our time frame.
Our very short time frame.
That's right. But the universe itself is deeply chaotic in terms of how it functions. But when you think of love, like that sort of theological understanding of love. I think that's what I was getting at in the text that I sent to you, is that it is it's a paradox, right? That God, I like what Rohr says, God loves things by becoming them.
Yeah.
And that's what I was just putting a Heideggerian spin on Rohr's.
Yeah.
When I say this idea that, it overcomes human self-love. Like, we create things to create, right? Sometimes to coerce or control, to bring order to chaos. But sometimes we do create out of love, right?
Yeah.
My children are offspring of a creative biological process that was initiated by love, right, between two people. But the idea here is my children carry a part of me within them, right? And the same abilities that I have to some extent exist within them. And part of the reason of that procreative process was that they would function and learn from me certain aspects that I thought were admirable, like love and kindness and servitude to people who are less fortunate. I say it all the time, loving people when they least expect it, least deserve it. And I think that aspect of God saying, here I am, not an I in the
Right.
the being sense, but in the essential sense of that which is. I am. I mean, it's what he says he is. So how do I just no longer exist in solitude, but exist within a creative process that all of these elements of creation itself carry a piece of me with them? And that's why I love that song we sing at church a lot. What is it called? So Will I.
Yeah.
It's a very poetic understanding of, he says, everything a canvas in a work of art called love. That's it. And to answer O'Hare, like, dude, love is everything. Love is everything. Love, when we say love wins, what we're saying is that is what overcomes poverty. That is what overcomes loneliness. That is what overcomes isolation. That is what overcomes war. That is what overcomes enemy. I can disagree with an atheist 100%, and we could be very tumultuous toward each other. But the moment I sit down and have a beer with that person and go, dude, I love you, bro. Like, I love you. Like, you're an awesome guy. You have some great ideas. I don't always agree with them, and it's that overcoming. It doesn't mean it's an overcoming the disparity of disagreement in ideas.
Yeah.
But it's overcoming the dehumanization of you're less than if you believe this, or you're less than if you don't believe that. And so that's what we say. Like, love is still very mysterious, but God loves things by becoming them. And what is the greatest thing? Love. And that is where God exists, within those patterns of love that we see. And so creation for me is a resounding residual effect of God doing what God is, and that is love. So love is, for me, it's an inevitable functionality of whatever God is, So
Yeah. Well, I guess it would have to be, right? Otherwise, there wouldn't be creation. There would only be God. Well, of course, the Kabbalists would say, yeah, there only is God.
There only is God, yeah.
Right. So this time of year, you can imagine people thinking about the concept that you just laid out, right? That creation is this reverberation and this inevitable process of love becoming.
Yes.
Right? Would that be a way to put it?
That's it.
Becoming grass, becoming stars, becoming whatever, right?
Yep.
Humans. Then you have inevitably going through those same minds, yeah, But there are people right now at Christmas time who live under bridges, whose kids go to bed hungry. There are people who are on their deathbed this time of year because they have a terminal illness. There are families breaking up through divorce this time of year.
Yep.
So many different difficult, tragic, even things that are evil taking place. So how is that still love reverberating, becoming, if we're saying that's what creation is?
Yeah.
The motivation would be in love too, by the way, right?
Yeah, I think what we're doing is that coming into being itself is the actuality, the actuation of love. But if freedom is a part of that, then the freedom to make bad choices that end up in me getting lung cancer because I smoke 3 packs a day or whatever, right? Freedom is still involved in that.
Yeah.
If I chose to, make certain choices of that life, that gift of love that was given, but I get a lot of times many people didn't make those choices. They are just affected by the choice of another, right? To be exploited or whatever the case may be. And that's where it gets really hairy. Like God seems to be silent on these things, that there's not a whole lot of intervention into that. But that's where I say, Rohr's understanding of the principles that are always true. When Cain slays Abel, it's not that God doesn't know what's happened. God's not unaware or ignorant of it. But he asks a very simple question, like, where is your brother? And Cain's reply is, am I my brother's keeper? And God remains absolutely silent on that. So I love what Epictetus said. If people find you strange in your silence, they will never understand your words. And God is strangely silent in response to that because there are no words necessary. The answer is always already, yes, you are, because you both carry the same divine genetic material that has been, I don't know what another word, to impart it into you to love and care for one another. And somehow along the way, our own sense of control and coercion spilled out over just trying to control nature and finding utility for it into one another. And this is why I'm deeply Heideggerian. It is one thing for me to look at a tree and go, oh yeah, a tree gives me fruit. It gives me photosynthesis for oxygen. It beautifies my land to increase my property value, or it gives me shade on a hot day. Or this cup, well, it holds my liquid and keeps it from burning my hand or whatever. These are all objects that I have appropriated meaning and purpose on. The danger is when I do that to you, when I do it to another being. Bread is only lovable insofar as he is useful to me.
Yeah.
And that is where humanity has lost its divine sense of purpose, of being, that we see throughout history, man, for socioeconomic theory, theologically, culturally, historically, that every time humanity's gone awry is when we have looked at one another as vehicles of utility rather than vehicles of divinity. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. Yeah. So we lost it. And well, we lose it from time to time, right? And that's where you see real suffering taking place, is when we do that. But we didn't lose it totally, right?
Right.
This time of year again is a good reminder of that. Today so you'll never watch a Hallmark show that's about the birth of Christ.
Right.
Right? But there's just gobs and gobs. My wife makes me watch at least 2 a night, and we never get through them all, right? These Hallmark Christmas shows. And all of them, even though they never mention Jesus, I mean, you'll be lucky if you even hear a religious Christmas hymn being sung, right?
Yeah.
In these shows. So, but what you do always see is this reminder of that divine purpose,
Yep.
right? To value the other.
Yep.
You always see that. Always.
That's right.
I think, Jesus, right? So let's say that Jesus is, at the right hand of the Father, and he's staring down at the Hallmark movies. The Jesus I know, man, he'd be like, good on you.
Yeah.
I like these shows. I don't need to be in the middle of this show.
That's right.
I just want to see the qualities of this human divine experiment.
Yeah.
Right. Coming to the surface.
Yeah.
And creating something and becoming something that maybe it's predestined to be. I don't know. I guess that'd be another thing to kind of toss around philosophically. But
Yeah.
I guess if God is love, then the impetus, the force that drives creation, is love.
Yeah.
So this is all, despite all the evil and the suffering and darkness and whatnot, it's still the reverberation, the vibrations, the becoming of love, and all this variety.
That's right. So in that sense, love is not necessarily a verb, right? Love is, for me, it's an awareness of the other, like the otherness of the other, the alterity. Mm-hmm. And when we think, I tend to agree with Nietzsche. Like, I mean, it's easy for us to sort of define certain things as evil, like harming a child that's evil, right? It's an evil act. But when we think of like things like war, when war is caused, like for me, love has lost its awareness of the other and has only considered the proper, the self, right? Like you look at what Hitler did. Like, we do these sociological experiments. Would you have gone against the Nazi teaching if you lived in 1940 Germany? And most people are like, of course I would have. No, you would not have. We know this for a fact.
Yes.
You would have been a Nazi like everyone else, right? Because in the same way you are an American like every other American, right? Mm-hmm. And you think, man, this is the greatest nation on earth for the most part, mm-hmm. right? And Hitler sort of promoted and sort of precipitated that notion of self-love, the homeland, like the German. And the Germans bought into that, but it was isolation of self-love, not the awareness of seeing the otherness of the other, the alterity, the value. And same thing with what's going on in Ukraine. Like it is a war of self-love of Ukrainians and Russians, right? America, self-love, like put up a wall, right? Mm-hmm. No, put up a freaking mirror and take a reflection at what we are now. Read what's read what's on the freaking Statue of Liberty, bro.
Yeah.
Like, come on. Like, I'm all for border security and all these things, but at the end of the day, when we become too focused on the isolationist understanding of self-love, and I'm all about loving the self, but what do I love about myself? Dude, I get emotional. What I love about myself is what makes me has nothing to do with me. My children make me daddy. The congregation makes me pastor. You make me a friend. And I love that about myself because it has nothing to do with myself. Now, I have to operate and function in a particular kind of way to be friendly. to be a good dad that is loved. You know
Sure.
what I'm saying? But at the end of the day, man, true love, authentic divine love is the awareness of, again, I'll say it because I like the way it rhetorically sounds, is not looking at others for the sake of utility, but looking at others with the sense of divinity. Like God is in you too. In that homeless man asking for money on the corner, God is in him. And not only is God in him, God is fully in him.
Yeah.
Like I do this thing, you've seen me do it. I said, if I shot off the earth at the speed of light to the edge of the universe where it's pushing into whatever nothingness is, God is always already there and fully present. And if I do a 180 and go back to the other edge of the universe, the speed of light, God is always already there. And if I go to the most subatomic particle, molecular structure of what constitutes my being, of the 33 trillion cells that make Troy, God is present in every single one of them. And not only present, fully present. And dude, when you look at that similarity is what unites us. But yet we want to focus on what divides us. Our difference of opinion, a difference of ideas, thoughts. Like thoughts are, like those are, epistemological. I'm focused on the ontological, right? Moving from here to here, right? That's why I say, if your belief has to be more than just believable. It has to be livable.
Yeah.
And if I live in such a way that doesn't consider the other, then I'm not really living in love. I'm living in isolation into extent, and that's the thing.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just ranted there, man. But
No, that's all good stuff, man. Really good. And when you think about the idea of, I mentioned the Kabbalists before, right?
yes.
But let's look at the Buddhists just for a second. The Buddha talked about the fact that, well, there's a Greek philosopher that said this too. You can never step in the same river twice.
That's right.
Right? So, because the river is constantly in change, right? And all things are in change like that. Like this guy had this insight.
The river is
before
not
we
the
even
same.
knew that there was a cell, right?
Yeah.
Much less 3 trillion or whatever.
That's right.
And those cells are changing constantly, so that there's a complete change every 7 years. So you are definitely, even from a physiological standpoint, you are a different thing than you were 7 years ago.
That's right.
And that, when you really boil it down, it's every millisecond.
Yes.
You're changing, right? And yes, certain things, you make me a friend. My kids make me a father, all those examples that you gave. My wife makes me a husband. All of that is like a macro view of this super macro reality, right? That everything is tied together like that.
Yep.
And the reality is then, when I look at the homeless guy, I am looking at a mirror.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's all the Creator.
Yep.
So what I do to the other, I am doing it.
Yep.
In some way. It's mysterious, right? But I am doing it to me too. I don't know. It would just be so great. And I think that this is something that's happening, as time goes on with this whole human experiment, this hybrid animal spirit thing.
Yeah.
That I feel like we are evolving in a healthy way. At least it seems like there are more people that are doing that than there used to be.
Yep.
Like today in America, for example, you had previously, like when we were born, right? Religion was just a given part of society, right?
Yep.
You went to church because that's what you did.
Yep.
Right. So it was more like a folk religion, right? It was more like a social thing, part of that construct. And we lament the death of Christianity in America or the decline of it, right? But in a way, we don't need to.
That's right.
Right? Because there is, what do we want? Do we want just this social construct, or do we want this genuine relationship that Jesus came to teach us about, this abundant life, right? That Jesus taught us. Well, we want that.
Yeah.
We don't want the social construct. Who cares about that? That doesn't constitute a Christian,
right?
A little Christ. What constitutes a little Christ is a person that's actually living into being within the being, right?
That's right.
So
taking creation, going back to the creation. So the way I look at it is like sort of concentric circles, right? At the center, you have the creation itself, right? And it's what Immanuel Kant called the Sing und Ich, the thing in itself. And it's almost inaccessible to us because we have freedom to think and to observe and to appropriate, right? To situate. So like this cup, I look at it as a cup, but is that the thing in itself? No, if I had a molecular, a microscope, I would see things within the thing itself that I couldn't otherwise sense, right?
Yeah.
So you look at creation, that is what is given. It is given. Like I don't think I'm a brain in a vat somewhere. But again, I can't absolutely prove that, but I don't live that way either, Mm-hmm. But it's the next concentric circle out is where you have other elements of the creation itself, where we touch upon the thing itself. But it's like, we say, this is what that is. This is what that is. This was created by God in 6 days. I don't think that, So it's hard to find because of, again, the culture, the way in which we're taught, sort of, the way in which we're educated. Like the word education comes from educare. It literally means the care of the self. Like education is the care of oneself, educare. And so like when I was in seminary, like I had to answer questions in accordance with the doctrinal position of that particular school I was in order to get a passing grade. Mm-hmm. So that's huge, dude. That's huge for you to, again, it wasn't about community. It was about conformity. You have to conform to this belief. And so the thing in itself, creation, has been appropriated upon by God made this in 6 days. The earth is 10,000 years old. And there are people who believe that. Mm-hmm. And thus their interaction with the given is rather bizarre, right? It's rather bizarre because everything has to align to that particular ideology that it's touching. But other people say, no, the thing itself observationally is showing us that it's quite older than that. And so they may come to a radically other conclusion. Well, there is no God. The thing just came into existence at some point, whatever. And so all that means is like we are convoluting what is given with human ideas and sort of human rationality that is very, very limited. You don't need to read much philosophy to understand our rationality has a liminality to it. And it's a danger to say, this is truth, capital T, truth. When the way even Jesus uses that word truth, I mean, this is what Nietzsche says, the death of God in Nietzsche is not the death of some being, it's the death of truth, the death of conscious, like a conscientious self. And so the whole point is, what is truth? Well, truth, you can't talk about what is true without talking about going towards truth. It's always an ongoing process.
Discovery.
That's right. And that's a letting. It's the letting, the living, the letting truth happen as opposed to controlling it, doctrinally propositioning it. I believe in God Almighty, the Father, I believe in Jesus Christ. He ascended into all these things. Though even those creeds and doctrines are technology, techne, a way of thinking to control and to coerce. Whereas the essence of God is to let. Like, I believe in evolution. I believe. And guess what that is? Love lets. And there is a letting in creation that points back to a loving God who, because of him being love itself, not just the human appropriation of love, because I would agree with Kevin O'Hara. What the hell is love anyway?
Yeah.
Well, if we're thinking about it in human terms, then we got to go by certain definitions. But if I think about it in something that transcends the human mind and rationality, then love is a letting. It is a letting unfold and fold in. And so that for me is the motivation of God in terms of the creative force of God is always situated initially, beginning with love that lets happen, that lets unfold, that lets evolve, that lets learn,
So freedom really would be central in that picture.
Absolutely.
And therefore the potential for what we have labeled as evil and suffering and so on.
Yeah.
See, I think that's a better, I don't know. I shouldn't compare,
but again, we have to be careful, man, because I tell this story, and I think I've told you, like, I look at homelessness with a very different lens than most people. Like, when a homeless person asks me for money, I feel it's my responsibility, because what is responsibility? My ability to respond. If I have an extra $5 on me, I'm giving it to them, like, because that doesn't harm me financially in any way.
Yeah.
But I remember, man, we were doing mission work in New Orleans, and we're working at the New Orleans mission, and we would provide, we cooked, we provided a chapel service, and we ate with the residents, men, women, and children, about 350. But right across the street, from here to the office, was an overpass where people put their tents, and they chose through their own freedom and volition to stay there. And my sort of dictation to my team was, we don't go there, because those people are choosing to stay there. If they want food, shelter, a hot meal, a cot, and shower, they can come here. Like, they can come here through their own volition and come and get this free of charge. Mm-hmm. The only caveat is they got to sit through a 40-minute worship and teaching and prayer. That's it. But they can get food, shelter, a shower, wash their clothes, and be in a safe, covered environment. We don't go over there. Well, one of these super spiritual families, without my permission, without my knowledge, went to a Little Caesars Pizza and bought a bunch of pizzas and decided to go across the street and hand these out. And one of the young ladies there, who was, I don't know, she's probably 20, 21, goes up to a tent and says, "Hey, would you like a free pizza?" And this man steps forward, pulls out a knife, and puts it to her throat.
What?
And he goes, "What are you doing here? Why are you here? Go back to the mission where those people are choosing to go." He goes, "I could kill you now, and no one would miss me. But I feel that there would be a lot of people who would miss you. Get out of here and take your pizza with you." And of course, I get called into this office, and she is beside herself, shaking. Her family's around her, praying or whatever. I'm like, this is not a problem for you to solve. This is a place for you to be aware of, that there are some people who choose this way of life, who choose that I'm not going to be a part of some sort of organized, governmental, whatever. I choose to live my life on my own terms. And part of doing that is this, And that really changed my mind, man, regarding a lot of the ideas of poverty and homelessness, that there are some people who absolutely choose that way of life. Like, an overwhelming majority of them absolutely choose that way because they don't want a job, they don't want to play the game or whatever, however you want to rhetorically function. And so for that also is letting. That is letting. And sometimes you have to love someone enough to let them do their thing. and go, I can't change you. It's not my job to change you. And I say this all the time. As a pastor, it's not my job to convict people with my words. It's my job to convince people with my life, how I live. Watch how I live, because, dude, I got fundamentalist conservatives that give me shit all the time about the messages I preach, my lifestyle, having a couple of whiskeys every now and then, whatever the case may be. But it's not my job to convict you. My job is to convince you is that, hey, I can do these things in an appropriate manner. And guess what? God's mind is not changed towards me. And it's not my job to convert anyone to some particular belief or ideology. But you know what my job is? Is to converse. And I've had hundreds of conversations with those same people who choose to live under those bridges. And the conversation is absolutely illuminating in that many of them love that particular kind of life. They're not accountable to people. They're not necessarily immoral people, but they're just sort of like, hey, this is how I choose to live. And I'm off the grid to some extent, whatever the case may be. But all that rambling to say, man, is that all that we see is this unfolding of God's letting, and it is a reflection of God's love. Now, not only do I create objects to maintain a sense of order or control or coercion, but your thoughts can do the same thing. Well, those people, they're living outside what my mind thinks is orderly, what my mind thinks is correct. Says who? You dig? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
So that's the whole point, is just because someone lives outside the cognitive construction of anti-chaos that you have built doesn't mean that they are immoral or ungodly or anything like that. Some of the most beautiful people I've ever met in my life are homeless. Some of the most brilliant people I've ever met live in absolute, utter poverty. And I've learned more from that than probably in school, for my organized, highly, controlled educational system that I had to check off all these boxes to get this very expensive piece of paper with my name embroidered on it,
Yeah.
So, but anyway.
No, man, it's dead on.
Sorry, man.
Dead on. No, that's all. It's all perfect. Again, I said when we sat down here, look, you pointed out the Christmas hat on the graphic. And I said, yeah, but we're not going to talk about Christmas at all. But actually, we did.
Yeah, we got to it.
We did, because what we're seeing celebrated from a Christian perspective at this time is the continuation and maybe even a ramping up with the birth of Christ, right? A ramping up of the love letting.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
And so there's this upgrade that occurs in the letting, or at least in the revealing of the love letting, There's more and more that we see of the love letting.
Yep.
That is. I think that's what's happening.
Yep.
I want to see more, man.
Yeah.
That's what I want to do.
That's right. Keep saying yes. That's what we do.
Keep saying yes, right? Yeah, follow Mary.
That's right.
Be the eternal yes.
That's right.
All right, man.
Appreciate
this was
it.
good. Love it.
Love it, man. Thank
Love
you.